Welcome to this explainer, everyone. Today we're diving right into a landmark legal case that completely shifted how we view state accountability. We're going to unpack the complex and honestly, sometimes controversial doctrine of vicarious liability. To do that, we'll look really closely at a massive South African constitutional court case, often known as K versus Minister of Safety and Security. It asks a pretty terrifying question. What happens when the very people sworn to protect us become the perpetrators? And legally speaking, exactly who foots the bill when they do?
Here is our roadmap. We're going to start by looking at the betrayal of trust at the center of this case, move into understanding vicarious liability and the so-called deviation dilemma, check out some global perspectives, and then finally unpack the Constitutional Court's ruling and why this whole thing matters so much today.
All right, let's jump straight into Section 1, a betrayal of trust, focusing on the harrowing events of March 1999.
To really grasp the legal arguments here, we have to ground ourselves into facts, which are incredibly heavy. It was March 1999. A 20-year-old woman, who is referred to in court documents as MSK, was stranded in the early hours of the morning after a date refused to take her home. It's around 4 a.m., she's looking for a phone, and she's approached by a fully uniformed police officer driving an official South African police service vehicle. He offers her a ride home. Understandably, she accepts, getting into a car with 3 on-duty, uniformed officers. But they don't take her home. Instead, they drive the wrong way, and these 3 officers brutally attack and rape her. She eventually manages to escape, and those officers were later arrested, convicted, and sentenced to life in prison.
It's a profound, visceral breach of trust. The minister actually admitted in this case that these men, as on-duty policemen, had a specific constitutional and statutory mandate to ensure public safety. They were literally employed to prevent the exact horror they committed.
So, the individual perpetrators were locked up. Justice served, right? Well, not entirely. Ms. K also sued the Minister of Safety and Security, essentially suing the state for damages. But here's the kicker. The High Court and the Supreme Court of Appeal dismissed her claim, which brings up our massive legal roadblock. Why on earth wouldn't the state be responsible for the actions of its own on-duty police officers who were driving an official state vehicle?
To answer that, we move to Section 2, Understanding Vicarious Liability. Basically, when is the boss responsible for a rogue employee?
In plain English, vicarious liability is the legal principle that lets a victim hold an employer accountable for a worker's mess, even if the employer didn't directly do anything wrong. It's a rule designed to make sure victims actually get compensated by an entity that can afford to pay up, rather than trying to get blood from a stone if the employee is bankrupt. But there is a huge caveat. The employee must be acting in the course and scope of their employment.
Historically, the law draws a hard line between an employee doing their job and one going on what the legal world rather quaintly calls a frolic of their own. Think of it like this. If an employee is furthering the employer's business, the employer is on the hook. But if an employee completely abandons their work to do something 100% personal, they've deviated. And traditionally, when that happens, the employer gets off scot-free.
Which leads us straight into Section 3, the deviation dilemma, and the core legal roadblock in Ms. K's case. I want you to really think about this question for a second. If police officers are committing a heinous crime purely for their own gratification, are they still acting as police officers? The Supreme Court of Appeal looked at this and said basically no. They concluded the deviation was so extreme and so entirely disconnected from real police work that the officers had abandoned the state's instructions. By raping Ms. K, they were acting for themselves, not furthering the goals of the police force.
And this exposes a glaring flaw. Traditional law totally short-circuits when an employee intentionally deviates to commit a horrific wrong. It effectively creates a paradox where the worse the employee's behavior is, the more likely the employer is to escape liability. It completely leaves the victim out in the cold, unable to hold the empowering institution accountable.
So, how do we fix it? Let's zoom out to Section 4, Global Legal Perspectives, to see how the rest of the world wrestles with this exact loophole.
South Africa is definitely not the only country dealing with this. Over in the UK, in a case called Lister, the House of Lords held a school liable for abuse by asking if the bad acts were sufficiently closely connected to the employment. In Canada, the Baisley versus Curry case saw the Supreme Court ask if the employer's enterprise created or enhanced the risk of the abuse. And in the US, cases like Primark rely on strict federal tort claims, which honestly can yield pretty fragmented results depending on technicalities, like whether the officer was officially on the clock.
But looking at these global trends, we see a massive shift.
Progressive courts everywhere are abandoning the rigid factual question of, were they following orders? Instead, they're asking bigger, normative questions. Did the job create the trust that allowed the abuse? Did the enterprise provide the opportunity? They are prioritizing actual fairness and deterrence over semantic arguments about what fits into a job description.
Armed with that context, let's look at Section 5, the Constitutional Court ruling and South Africa's shift to normative constitutional values.
Enter Justice O'Regan. Delivering the judgment, she made it absolutely clear that common law cannot just exist in a vacuum. It has to be infused with the normative values of the Constitution. You can't just apply ancient legal tests like a math equation. You have to run them through the filter of fundamental rights, like the right to safety, dignity, and freedom from violence.
To pull this off, the court leaned on something called the Robbie test. It's a two-step checklist. Step 1 is subjective. Were the employees acting solely for their own interests? Well, yes, clearly. But step 2 is objective. Despite their terrible personal motives, is there still a sufficiently close link between their actions and the employer's business? And it's right here, in step 2, that Justice O'Regan injected those constitutional values. She highlighted 3 absolutely crucial factors. First, these officers had a statutory duty to protect the public. Second, Ms. K placed her trust in their uniform. She didn't know these guys. She trusted the state that they represented. And third, this is the real mic drop moment, by committing the crime, they simultaneously failed their constitutional duty to protect her. They committed a terrible act and omitted their duty at the exact same split second.
So the link between the rogue cops and the state was undeniable. This wasn't just a random crime. The opportunity would never have existed if Miss K hadn't trusted them as policemen. They took the authority the state gave them, and they literally weaponized it against a citizen.
Let's bring it all home in Section 6, why this case matters and how it fundamentally evolved the common law. After years of grueling legal battles, the Constitutional Court finally flipped the script. They set aside the lower court decisions and declared the Minister of Safety and Security vicariously liable for the damages Ms. Khan suffered. The state was held accountable. This opened up a real, tangible pathway to compensation for the victim. And the ripple effects of this are massive. This case evolved the common law in a profound way. It slammed the door on legal loopholes that shielded the state when its agents abused their power. It proved that vicarious liability isn't just some dry, technical checklist. It's about normative justice, aligning the law with the true spirit of the Constitution and making sure institutions bear the risk of the immense authority they hand out.
So, I'm going to leave you with this final thought. It is an incredibly delicate balance between employer risk and justice for victims. When we give people power, who pays the price when they abuse it? Cases like this force us to decide what kind of society we actually want to live in. I hope this explainer has made this heavy yet completely fascinating legal shift clear, and, more importantly, sparked your curiosity to learn more about how the law shapes our reality. Thanks for joining me on this one.